Do you know who the inventor of the first successful submarine was? Or did you know that the word dollar actually means depression? How about, did you know that the rules of football used to say that you couldn't throw a forward pass more than 20 yards or across the goal line? For amazing facts and more stories like this, stay tuned for this week's episode. Before I dive into all of this, please hit the bell to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment. All that goes so far to helping me bring this 100-year-old brand back, essentially for the 21st century. Welcome back. This is Jeff Hix, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hix, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. For this week's episode, and for the next couple as well, there's 3 more piles of these archives, basically the proofs, right? Letters, photographs, all the documentation that the Hix family kept. And that was really the essence of the Strange As It Seems brand. Very different from Ripley's Believe It or Not and the other oddity comic strips of the day. Strange As It Seems took the truth of what they were doing and the facts they were presenting very seriously. And that's really, I think, the magic in the archives. And it kind of looks like it was my grandma Elsie was doing this. She was running the comic strip. This was about 1959, 60, and 61 where these piles were done. And I don't want to say she was phoning it in, but I think she was getting a little tired of the job in the sense of not taking the time to file everything back into subject matter, but she still was documenting. And I think my father graduated college in 1958, and so she was this was her early empty nest years, where I think she was, just continuing to do it. It was a labor of love, like it has been for the entire Hix family. I don't think there was ever lots of money made, still not to this day. But really fascinating stories in here. And as I scan it in, and as I continue as the curator and archivist for the Strange As It Seems, bringing it to the digital age, there's a lot of really good stories in here. And I wanted to just grab the best of them and share them with you today as another episode before I kind of put them all back into the archive. So let's dive in. And one of the first amazing stories that she featured in 1961, in fact, we'll just do a couple of stories from this date. Looks like March 31st of 1961, but she resurrected this story of Thomas Blood, amazing story of this Crook who basically stole the crown jewels from the Tower of London. But after he was caught, he convinced Charles II to give him a pardon, as well as a $2,500 a year pension. This goes all the way back to August 6, 1934 with John Hix. I think he featured it again even back to 1932. Colonel Thomas Blood, Irish adventurer, stole the crown and scepter of the King of England from under the guard's nose in the strong room of the Tower of London on the night of May 9th, 1671. He beat off one guard at the gate, but the alarm was spread and Colonel Blood soon was arrested and brought to trial. He was condemned to death, but the king ended up pardoning him. Crazy. I guess he was in the guise of a clergyman. That was part of it. But he not only was pardoned, but really convinced, I guess a very convincing talker, spread the rumor that he was a member of a gang whose members were sworn to avenge the death of any of their number. And Charles II heard of this, and I guess he timidly, because of this rumor, gave Blood a full pardon, gave him a pension, restored his Irish estates, and he soon became a royal favorite of the crown. Amazing story of Thomas Blood, stealer of the crown jewels, pardoned and restored. And here's kind of an interesting fact. There was actually an original, before the Pony Express was founded, there was a regular Pony Express 20 years earlier from Boston to Baltimore. Before the famous Western Pony Express, the original Pony Express was in the East. And Nebraska, one of the most fertile regions of the United States for farming, was actually once called the Great Desert because school geographies a century ago mistakenly labeled the fertile Nebraska territory the Great Desert. Settlement of Nebraska was impeded for years. Crazy. Strange as it seems, the inclusion of but 3 little words in the geography books of school children a century ago retarded for many years the settlement of the Nebraska Territory, including the Great North Platte Valley. Those words were the Great Desert. They were put there on the advice of Major Stephen Long, who was a topographical engineer of the United States Army, who in 1819 had been sent west to chart the Platte River country and the mountains beyond. The War Department was anxious to learn about all the topography of the country and to locate the best pass into the Rockies. Major Long spent 4 years at this work, but he followed the Platte into the mountains and upon conclusion of his work, made a detailed report to the War Department, which called the Nebraska Territory a desert because he thought the land was of little value. This is what he said of it. It is almost wholly unfit for cultivation and of course uninhabitable for people depending upon agriculture for their subsistence. Major Long then prepared a map of the region and had lettered upon it the words, the Great Desert. The map was widely reproduced in the nation's school geographies and for years after proved that the Platte region was very fertile, even though the notion of it being a desert persisted. You can see how these all tie in for Elsie, because that same day that she published the story about the Great Desert, she also grabbed that early watch owners apparently carried 2 watches. And this goes back even to really the early years when she took it over. She called it by Hix right after my grandfather died. But apparently, since they weren't very accurate, they used to average the time of watches, where 2 of them an average, and there's a bunch in here. Here's a 1,000-year-old watch. This is pretty amazing. A pocket sundial dating from the 10th century, probably the oldest watch at the time anyway. This was a John Hix one. And then on to compasses here as well. Apparently the lodestone, I remember hearing about that, was the first kind of magnet. It was a hard black stone with magnetic properties. And when it was hung by a string and pointed to the north and south, that's how the first compasses were invented, kind of strangely as it seems. And then on the nature side, talking about compasses, here's the traveler's palm. It serves as a compass to desert travelers because its prongs spread in a north-south direction. That's kind of amazing. It's of all the trees of Madagascar, the most striking is the Ravinala, or traveler's tree, Urania speciosa. It resembles a palm, its stem being crowned by a semicircle of oblong leaves spread out vertically in a fan shape. But the reason they call it a traveler's tree is a traveler can supply itself with water by breaking the lower ends of the leaf stalks, which hold drinkable water. And speaking of deserts, here's the Mirage mystery. This is also from 1961, but goes back to the John Hix days. Tons of data in here about the mystery of mirages. Nobody really knew how or why they do this, but it's caused by a refraction of light. We know that. Working through a layer of air, they've been observed not only in desert areas, but also at sea and up in the Arctic. Objects have been seen more than 1,000 miles distant without diminishing in size. Kind of amazing, and there's some pretty amazing history of mirages. Really kind of fascinating. Mr. Gordon's favorite story has the date 1878, when Custer's little army marched away from Fort Abraham Lincoln to play its part in the tragic battle of the Little Bighorn. The army had passed out of sight behind the hills. When those left in the fort, a mirage showed the column marching along through the sky, each man and horse clear. So lots of amazing stories in here about mirages, and really still a mystery exactly how they happen or how they occur. And a bunch of stories in here too, kind of on currency and money. I love this one. This goes back to 1935, close to the Depression, right? But the dollar actually means depression. Strange as it seems, trace the ancestry of our dollar, and you'll find it means depression. It comes from the word thaler, meaning valley or depression, so that kind of depression. The first coin from which we get the word dollar was minted in Bohemia in 1516 by the Count of Schlitz, also known for a great beer. These coins bore an effigy of Saint Joachim and were known as Joachim's thalers or Schlitzen thalers. They were equal to one gulden. Eventually, it came to be known simply as thalers, and the word migrated from one language to another, took on different spellings, known variously as the taliero, the daler, the dollar, the dalder, and eventually the dollar. And some other ones here, although New England shillings were minted for 34 years. They all bore the same date, 1652. And then, have you ever heard the expression not worth a continental? It's an old expression, but here's the American historical background of American coinage. Pretty amazing. Book here, a little booklet from the Bank of America. I'm not really sure what year that was, but the story of not worth a continental, several $100 million worth of currency issued for national defense in 5 years by the Continental Congress ended up depreciating to almost nothing, but it became kind of a patriotic duty for those that had invested in them and turned to worthlessness. But that's apparently that's just what one of the other sacrifices in the early American Revolution. And how about these currency notes worth 66 2/3 cents were issued by the Continental Congress? Here's kind of a rare coins on exhibition, obviously worth thousands of dollars at this point, but at the time were worth 66 2/3 cents. Crazy. And the final story on money here, how about John Hull, who minted the first coins in the American colonies? He received 1 shilling for every 20 he coined. And in answer to who invented the first submarine, the rumor was that it was Robert Fulton, who was also credited with inventing the steamship, although we showed in another episode that it was not him. It was actually someone before him. But John Philip Holland was an Irishman, and apparently it's not the first necessarily submarine, but the first successful submarine. He was an Irish school teacher, and he hated England. And while teaching school in Cork in the 1860s, he conceived the idea for a submarine, a craft which could wipe out British sea power. Coming to the U.S., he began to experiment, although he was not an engineer. And in 1895, he contracted to build a submersible for the government, then returned the $95,000 he'd been paid when the job could not be finished to his satisfaction. But his craft embodied most of the essential features of those in use today. So after more than 80 years, the submarine threatens to fulfill its original purpose. This is in 1941, but kind of a little known or oft forgotten inventor, John P. Holland, the Irish school teacher, credited with the principle of the first successful submarine. And here's one that Elsie pulled in 1959. And it looks like she grabbed it from another one of these John Hix scrapbooks about astounding scholars. Kind of amazing, but John Trumbull, famous American poet, passed entrance examinations at Yale when he was just 7 years old. Amazing. There's also Francis Bacon on this John Hix scrapbook. He matriculated at Trinity College when he was only 13. We've got William Sidis, completed 12 years of school in 12 months at the age of 8. How about that? Graduated with honors from Harvard in 1914 at 16. Became a teacher of mathematics at Harvard, 18 years old. Amazing. How about the wonder child of Lubeck, Christian Heineken? Mastered German, French, Latin, world geography, modern and ancient history before he died at the age of 4. Crazy. Walter Scott, immortal novelist and poet, entered Edinburgh University as a student at the age of 12. And Carl Witte, entered the University of Leipzig at 9, Doctor of Philosophy at 14, and Doctor of Laws at 16. Crazy, astonishing scholars. And on the same day, my grandma Elsie featured that Thomas Blood stealing the crown jewels story, she also grabbed this one about Justin Morgan, the famed horse and founder of the Morgan breed. Apparently, it was of an unknown ancestry. Kind of amazing. It was a new equine type, and nobody knew where it came from. All kinds of photographs in here. The Morgan Horse Club photograph, an entire pamphlet here on the Morgan breed, beautifully illustrated, famed for its great endurance. Fascinating. And a United States Department of Agriculture that actually included these. This came from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Amazing. But all ancestors, kind of a mysterious ancestry, and nobody knew where the horse came from. And my grandma loved to feature extraordinary women. And here's another young prodigy, Kirsten Flagstad. She was a celebrated Wagnerian soprano. What a beautiful photograph of her. And actually a handwritten letter from the well-known operatic star Kirsten Flagstad. That's a beautiful, beautiful handwritten letter that confirmed that she committed the entire role of Elsa in the opera Lohengrin. Did it at the age of 13, strange as it seems. And some really amazing stories in this. It looks like a proof, or I guess these were all the colors that were basically indicated for a Sunday comic that my grandma Elsie featured. This must have been somewhere in that 1959, 60, and 61. But she had all kinds of the proof and everything behind all of these. But some amazing stories. General Beauregard, Confederate soldier, between the states, he was offered the chief command of the Romanian and Egyptian armies. Kind of amazing. Did you know that to secure a driver's license in Russia, you have to pass an examination on the maintenance of the automobile engine? And there was some amazing stories in here from diplomats, Russian diplomats, that were really kind of amazing on how they had to go through that ordeal. The cottontail rabbit is neither a hare nor a rabbit. Crazy. Amazing story there. The Lacandan Indians, last survivors of the great Mayan civilization, lived the same way as they did 1,500 years ago. Several thousand were existing 30 years ago, and just a few hundred at the time remain. One of the final stories in here was really kind of fascinating to me. The fire extinguisher was used as a gravestone in Wrangell, Alaska, and here's a photograph of it. But there's even more to the story that goes all the way back to John Hix. This is like 1934. The above drawing, suggested by Miss Florence Tobin of Ketchikan and published in Strange as It Seems on October of 1930, resulted in the finding of a man who had been missing for 20 years and given up for dead. So there's more to it. A Strange as It Seems cartoon drawn in Washington, D.C. This was back before John Hix had even moved to Hollywood, where it was based for years and years. An aged mother and father living in New York State, a traveler in Alaska, a strange tombstone, and a man missing 20 years from his family. All these combined to furnish material for a strange story of the strange North Country. In 1930, Miss Florence Tobin of Ketchikan, Alaska, and there's some handwritten letters from her in here corroborating that as well. Actually, typed letter here. So apparently Mrs. Ray Broderidge, Stapleton, New York, saw the drawing and recalled that her brother-in-law, Jimmy Broderidge, was last heard of 20 years before in Wrangell. On behalf of his aged parents, she wrote to Miss Tobin asking her to locate Jimmy. Early in 1932, Miss Tobin located Jimmy at Beaver near the Arctic Circle. He was a trapper. He had promised to write home. And in the fall of 1933, Miss Tobin visited Staten Island and called on the Broderidge family. They had received Jimmy's letter, but the aged parents were firm in the belief that the letter was a forgery, written to make them happy. And last winter, Miss Tobin, back in Alaska, set out again to find Jimmy to give him news of home. Before she could get in touch with him, word was received that Jimmy was lost on the trail. They found him 2 weeks later, frozen to death, his snowshoes under his arm. A zigzag path back and forth across the trail testified to his last hours of delirium. And now there is another tombstone up Wrangell Way in Alaska, strange as it seems. And for all my fellow fishermen out there, the Widener Library at Harvard University, this is corroborated by a 1954 letter from the Harvard College Library, the assistant librarian, but they have a collection of 22,000 books on angling in 20 different languages. Can you imagine that many books even being written on fishing? And this is in 1954. And a couple stories of invention. This looks like 1959, December 18th. A couple of stories on the same day. The first, George Westinghouse. This goes back to even earlier in the Elsie Hix era. But he patented a new invention on an average of one every 6 weeks for 48 years. Incredible. 60 different manufacturing companies came out of George Westinghouse's inventions and patents. Amazing. And then the story of rubber. I covered this earlier back when I did some stories on the vulcanization of rubber and really kind of the sad, tragic story of Charles Goodyear. But this is a little more information on rubber. It was apparently discovered by an Italian. Columbus actually discovered it, although I kind of joke in that last episode, you can't really discover it if the Mayans were already playing with it. So, but it was first found, I guess, from the Western world by an Italian, named by an Englishman, first studied scientifically by a Frenchman, put to commercial use by a Scotsman, improved upon by a German, and then first vulcanized by an American. And that was the Charles Goodyear. Great episode, by the way. That if you want more information on kind of the sad story of Charles Goodyear, check out the other story below on that amazing, tragic story about how he never made a dime off his invention, strange as it seems. And here's the story of Jonathan Wild, which actually presages the story of Al Capone. Check this out. Notorious London gangster 200 years ago could not be convicted of his many crimes, but was finally hanged for his failure to report income. Crazy. This goes back Ernest Hix, all the way back to John Hix. But that, definitely presages. Public enemy number one was an English thug. But that's how they got Jonathan Wild, just the same way they got Al Capone. And yet another extraordinary woman featured by Elsie Hix, of course, but actually goes back to Ernest Hix, her husband, and John Hix as well. Amazing, Betty Zane. I hadn't heard of her before, but she was the hero of the Battle of Fort Henry back in the Revolutionary War, 1782. She, I guess they were nearly exhausted, completely out of ammunition. She ran 40 yards to a storehouse through a hail of enemy bullets and arrows and returned with a keg of powder poured in a tablecloth and ended up saving the fort. Never heard of her. Kind of amazing. The heroine of the attack on Fort Henry ran to a little log cabin where there was stored a keg of powder. The attack, which is now Wheeling, West Virginia, was made September 27th and 28th, apparently 1777. Betty Zane was one of the famous family of borderers, which gave the name to Zanesville, Ohio, as well as Zane's Trail, which was the first wagon road that penetrated through the Ohio country. Amazing Betty Zane. And a fascinating fact from the annals of football history. Before 1912, no more than 20-yard gains were allowed on forward passes. Kind of amazing. And a great little article in here by Robert Zupke, who was the coach of Illinois, told the story here of how the forward pass was introduced in the game. Now I'm starting my 25th season as a college coach. Many football fans in conversation assume there has been a revolutionary change in the game since I took hold at Illinois in 1913. Crazy. And are usually surprised when I reply, it's not been fundamentally changed. A fundamental change is something like the introduction of the forward pass, which is probably the most radical change made in the present century, which I guess happened just before he took over as coach. I was just out of college when the pass was introduced, and I recall that my colleague, Pop Warner, didn't like the idea at all. Pop thought it would wreak havoc with the game. The pass was inserted, of course, to open up things and take the premium off weight. Interesting. Pop thought that the game could be opened up by some kind of hocus pocus with the kick, and wrote tomes objecting to the innovation, but he was one of a few lone voices crying in the wilderness. But he's managed to do nicely with the offensive weapon he disliked. Crazy, some really interesting. I'll probably post this article because it really is fascinating about the early origins of the forward pass in football, and also mentioned in here that it used to be against the rules to throw the ball across the goal line to score a touchdown as well. Strange as it seems. And the final fact I'll pull, there's just so many, but we got to wrap it up, is I guess they were just grappling, John Hix was, and Elsie picked it up as well, with how much is $1 billion. I found it kind of poignant with the way we're grappling with billionaires today, not only on the economy, but the society at large. But here's one: at the rate of $1 a minute, it would take 1,900 years to spend $1 billion. So 19 centuries to spend $1 billion at the rate of $1 a minute. John Hix first picked this up from November 1936. Hobbies. But that wraps this week's episode, taken from some of the files in the back of the file cabinet that Elsie was just really kind of keeping up with the amazing stories and facts. There are thousands and thousands of them there. But if you like content like this, please hit the bell to subscribe. Leave a comment. I respond to them all. Leave a like. I'll be back next week. I've got 2 more piles like this to wade through and scan in, see if I can find some more fascinating stories. But before I go, I'll leave you with this quote from John Hix from his first book, Strange as It Seems. The author launches this book of the curious in nature and humankind on the vast sea of public opinion, with the hope that it will fulfill its mission to entertain and acquaint its readers with some of the marvels of the world in which we live.